Thank you very much, Yanis, and thank you to all of you for coming over here and listening to this great lineup of interdisciplinary scholars for our panel, Protect, Transform, Question, Feminist Political Thoughts and Environmentalism in Long-Term Perspective. And I'll just give a small breakdown of how we're going to structure this panel and then just really listen to our fantastic guests. So we wanted to have an interdisciplinary panel on purpose. So we have a literary scholar, Anna Seidel. We have Renata Hryciuk, an anthropologist. We have Katarzyna Stanczak-Wilczyk, a historian. And we have Julia Zachsede, a scholar of international relations. And all of these scholars work from a gendered and feminist perspective in their particular fields. And we have heard yesterday during the panel, for example, on cities and climate change, that many of the challenges of the green transformation will be gendered. Climate change will be tougher on single women-headed households, and climate change will lead to an intensification of care work, for instance. The idea would be in this panel to hear more in historical perspective, but also in global perspective about what this might mean, and at the same time to understand how feminist thought might make dynamic and galvanize, if you wish, but perhaps that's not the best metaphor, our political imaginaries to better understand sort of transformation and the social change needed to have a more just world. So we will begin with 10, 15-minute presentations with Anna Seidel. Then we will carry on with Renata's presentation and Julia's and Kasha's at the end, and I will say a bit more about that. And then they will have a small exchange because I think there are many points of intersection that are worth exploring between these very exciting people working in quite different fields. And at the end, we will open the floor for discussion. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Anna Seidel, who is a research associate at the Institute for Slavic and Hungarian Studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Dr. Seidel has a PhD that has in comparative literature, and has also researched theater studies and European literatures at the University of Vienna, at the Freie Universität Berlin, and at the Humboldt University. She has looked at representations of cities during times of crisis, and especially she's now focusing on petrofiction, especially as it relates to entanglements between Galicia and the United States in the 19th century. So, please.
Should I sit or should I go there?
I think sit.
Oh, sit. Okay. So in order to not talk too long, I prepared something that I'm gonna read. I'm sorry for that, but I think this will help us to really stay in our schedule. I will try to not make it sound too red. We live in times when the urgency for transformation is unmistakably clear. Climate change is manifesting in all regions of the world. With our own eyes, we can see that all around the world, measures to address, contain, and mitigate climate change were implemented far too late. Despite this delay and the increasingly apparent consequences of climate change, even for the global north, there is no consensus on the urgency of transitioning to environmentally friendly lifestyles and energy systems, especially in Western societies. A tangible example of the controversy surrounding this topic can be seen in the election campaign posters for the EU Parliament, displayed right outside this tent. I guess you saw them. And the Green Party in Austria advocates for a greener Austria in a greener Europe, and subsequently for the implementation of further measures to protect the non-human environment. In contrast, the radical right-wing party, FPÖ, and I call them like that really consciously, demands an end to transformative activities regarding energy politics and systems. Their posters call these measures eco-communism, a label written in large red letters, demonizing the European Union's initiatives to transform the energy system as detrimental to the well-being of real Austrians. We can also discuss whether these initiatives of the European Union are really green, but that's not my topic today. The fact that right-wing populism and authoritarianism as represented by the FPÖ goes hand in hand with climate protection skepticism or even climate denial is nothing new. It is a tried and tested topos from the election campaign of the Republican Party in the USA in 2016. In fact, following Donald Trump's election back then, green transformation efforts were scaled back in favor of promoting fossil fuels. Concurrently, as several scholars have already shown, Trump introduced authoritarian practices and structures to the US political system. In her essay on petromasculinity, which some of you might know, political theorist Kara Daggett describes this intersection of fossil fuel advocacy and authoritarianism as fossil fascism. She argues that fossil fascism serves the capitalist interests of the fossil fuel industry, influencing economic processes, and interests of the fossil fuel industry influencing and benefiting a lobby fearful of losing financial profits. I mean, that's clear. However, Daggett also posits that the drive to continue extensive fossil fuel extraction is tied to issues of identity and cultural meaning. She suggests that the fear of ending fossil fuel extraction is linked to identity and gender anxieties, giving rise to petromasculinity, a notion that lost masculinity can be reclaimed through the allegiance to oil. This leads us to several questions. When and what kind of masculinity was actually lost, if it needs to be regained now? And what role does oil or petroleum play in this context? To answer this, we need to consider the influence of energy and the raw materials used to produce it on gender identities in general. Researchers in the energy humanities, such as Sheena Wilson, Imre Seemann, and Dominic Boyer, assert that energy and oil in particular shape the societies we build and live in. Wilson, in her article Gendering Oil, demonstrates how fuel company advertising campaigns reinforce heteronormative gender stereotypes and imaginaries, positioning women as domestic mother figures or as the humanized allegories of nature. For example, Shell does that. Although the rise of oil as a dominant fuel coincided with the successes of feminist movements, and we have to talk about that too, and perhaps even facilitate them on a pragmatic level, symbolically, the oil industry and its substantial influence on politics, society, and the economy thus reinforce patriarchal role models. Many feminist political theorists therefore rightly call for a green transformation that goes beyond the transformation of energy systems. They argue that an energy transition must also bring about systemic change, a change that transforms the position of women and other marginalized groups in society. An energy transition should not be solely an economic one, but also, as Sheena Wilson states, a social and cultural one. And this is where I come in with the literature now. It is this demand for a social and cultural transformation from a fossil-fueled patriarchal symbolic order to an inclusive, gender equality-driven green order that brings phenomena such as petromasculinity to thrive. They try to maintain the status quo regarding both the ways of energy production and the construction of gender identities. But does the transformation of the materials used to produce energy inevitably bring about social and cultural change? Well, the answer is no to that. Energy itself does not create transformation. It is the valuation of energy sources and the ways in which they are socially, economically, and politically integrated and imagined that transforms society. To bring about social and cultural change, it will therefore not be enough to change the sources of energy. It is also necessary to identify and analyze the narratives, identities, and symbolisms that constitute the structures which the use of a certain material for energy production has created. In our case, these structures constitute modernity, or rather petromodernity, as Imre Seemann and others call the modern era we live in because of the massive influence of petroleum on our societies and everyday lives. In order to understand the identities petromodernity has created, we can turn to a range of cultural representations, music, films, art, I decided, because I am a literary scholar and that's my job, to turn to literature, and more precisely to early petrofiction from the late 19th and the early 20th century. Really bad literature, by the way. I analyze how oil is represented and staged on a narrative level there. Through this analysis, I aim to uncover the roots of petro-modern constructions of identity and gender. But first of all, what is petrofiction? I don't know, does anybody know what petrofiction is? Well, the term petrofiction was coined by a literary scholar, Amitav Ghosh, in 1992, so it's an old term, actually, in a review of the novel Cities of Salt by Abdar Rahman Monif. He states that oil implies a specific invisibility, which is evoked by the peripherality of oil-producing regions and their multilingualism. Therefore, he claims oil hardly appears in literary representations, even in literatures, from major oil-producing and oil-consuming regions, such as the USA and Canada. This can, of course, be read as a symptom of the all-encompassing influence of oil and the oil-driven industry on all areas of today's life, particularly in the global north. In fact, oil is everywhere. We have it in the, I don't know, materials for this tent and everywhere. It's everywhere. But it still remains invisible. Following this argument, there are few texts that can be read as petrofiction, and at the same time, all texts could be read as such. For example, the American automobile texts by the Beatniks. These, I think you know, Jack Kerouac, On the Road, and so on. Well, these later texts of petrofiction that Ghosh writes about reflect the intrinsic systemic relevance of oil for politics, society, and the economy. Early petrofiction written before the Second World War, and therefore before the big oil boom also in the United States and Western Europe, doesn't hide the extraction of oil and the transformation processes oil brought about. This applies in particular to texts about the first industrialized regions, oil regions in the world, Pennsylvania, Texas in the United States, and Galicia in Central Europe. Liberal capitalist extractivist structures developed there from the 1850s onwards, leading to a massive exploitation of environmental and human resources. The literary texts set in these regions reflect and document this environmental damage caused by the barely regulated extraction of oil, but in them we can also identify gendered stereotypes and that point to how gender was constructed at the roots of petromodernity. For example, Hermann Blumenthal's 1913 novel Der Weg zum Reichtum, which can be translated to The Road to Wealth, so you can hear in the title it's not really good literature, describes the social, and please don't read it, it's really not good, describes the social and financial rise of a man in Borislav, Galicia, now Ukraine, from a property manager to an oil magnate who first becomes very rich very fast through oil extraction, but later withdraws from the oil business after a mining accident in which his business partner dies. A few years later, his daughter Sophie, the heir to the property, marries the son of the business partner who died in the accident. They both move back to Borislav, and the young man enters the already flourishing and competitive oil business. However, his risky business maneuvers cause him to lose his moral integrity and in the process the favor of his wife, who leaves him for another oil man. Well, oil is described in this text as a commodity that is traded, but also as a substance that casts a spell over people from which they cannot escape. This phenomenon of oil fever, which also refers to the phenomenon of gold fever in literature, but that's another story. But this phenomenon, which tends the always male protagonist to commit immoral acts, is a prevalent theme in early petrofiction. We can find it too in Ignacy Maciejowski's 1894 text Nafta, where the protagonist becomes feverish as he approaches the oil mine in Podniebie near Dukla, now Poland, and only recovers from this fever after leaving this region. Early petrofiction thus depicts oil as an intoxicant that drives people to immoral acts, men mostly, thereby shifting the blame for the protagonist's moral failures from human actions to non-human nature. It is not humanity that is to blame for environmental destruction, but nature itself. Interestingly, many male characters who amass wealth from oil extraction receive the financial means to do it from women, often through marriage. So these men, initially morally upright, become corrupted not only by the allure of nature, but also by the opportunities provided to them by women. We can see that early petrofiction employs clear dualisms here. On the one side, on the one hand, there is the feminine, which is associated with nature. On the other hand, masculinity, which is associated with culture. Very classic. So if we put two and two together, we see that the texts depict women and nature as jointly responsible for the moral degradation of civilized male men, and therefore also for the precariousness of their own existence, because the degradation of male men has a massive impact on the women's and the non-human environment's fate. In German, we would say Selbstschuld. In all these texts, the woman thus is staged as evil, although she, in fact, has no agency in the narration whatsoever. Women provide the capital, but they do not act. Only rarely they visit the oil wells or mines. They benefit from oil profits or suffer from their losses, yet remain passive if it comes to the plot, a plot which, again, is deeply intertwined with oil extraction. This passivity towards the transformation processes related to oil extraction is also reflected in the 1931 short story by the American author Winifred Sanford, Fever in the South. It is about the Texas oil boom in the early 20th century. One of the characters in the text, Miss Carey, an old landowner who is hosting oil men in her home, is taken to an oil mine by Mr. Donovan, the story's protagonist in the paradigm of an oil man, to show her his success. This is Miss Carey's first encounter with the drilling rig. She finds it disconcerting and terrifying, and the story concludes with the reflection of Miss Carey that she might be displaced, likening her situation to the biblical Esau. Some of you might know him, selling his birthright for a mess of pottage. He sold his to Jacob, I think. Here, too, the woman is portrayed as separate from the oil industry, without agency despite her critical view of the consequences of the transformation processes brought about by oil extraction. This passive role of women in relation to the oil industry and its rise is also evident in their association with domesticity. In early petrofiction, women's visits to oil sites mainly serve to bolster the male protagonist's image as a great entrepreneur or a patriarch. Female characters typically remain at home, like the already mentioned Miss Carey, who never leaves her house due to feeling alienated by the transformative impact of the oil industry in her town. Others, like Sophie in Blumenthal's novel, find no suitable activities in oil regions and long for cultural experiences like theater or opera and can't find such in Borislav, for example. Summing up, we can see that women in early petrofiction are situated in marginal and private spheres. They serve to facilitate the development of male protagonists or to provide commentary on them. However, women lack their own agency within these narratives and remain on the periphery of male-centered stories. If we look at these narrative roots of petromodernity, we finally understand what masculinity has been lost and needs to be regained according to groups with petromasculine tendencies. We also start to understand that fossil fascism is not only about fossil fuels. Both not only glorify oil and the economic system that is circling around it, they also criticize female agency, promoting the suppression of women in societies and the glorification of male violence and domination. All these tendencies can be found already in early petro-narratives. As we can see, oil has not only an economic, ecological, and political relevance, it has also shaped the narratives about our societies and constructed or at least reinforced heteronormative and patriarchal gender identities. A journey to the literary roots of the petromodern narrative can help us uncover these identities, transform them, and thereby provide the basis for a truly green transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now my invitation would be towards your co-panelists if they anything sparked their immediate curiosity and excitement in your presentation. And I see Julia and then Kasia.
Thanks a lot. Ooh, that's loud. Thanks very much for your presentation. I find it really interesting to learn about petrofiction and petromasculinity. I was wondering, because this is an event on green transformations, and we've heard now about, the link between oil, masculinity, violence, the political economy. So I was wondering, how could the findings that you've presented and the analysis that you did be applicable or used to understand and maybe even criticize current developments towards green futures? So do you see any relations between the previous forms of petromasculinity and current forms of, green masculinity that, however, might be similarly hierarchical, violent, etc.?
Okay. Thank you for this presentation. We share the interest in a very bad literature, so it was really interesting for me. And this concept of petromodernity and petrofiction, petromasculinity is something fascinating for me. And I just want to ask, what do you think, to what extension this kind of petrofiction gives an universal pattern of understanding some environmental issues and how it was connected to the economy? Because I have in mind the example of the fiction developed in Poland after the Second World War, also very bad literature in the socialist realism style about the coal mines. And this is exactly the same pattern about using the nature by men, and also the role of women is surprisingly very similar to this you described in this petrofiction. So I'm really interested. How do you find it a very universal way to say about connections between environmental issues and economic?
Yeah, I just have another quick question regarding Trump and petromasculinity. Because I was wondering, you were speaking about these dichotomous understandings of femininity, masculinity, and especially if we look at Trump, for example, it's not only about fossil fuels, authoritarianism, and masculinity, but there's also a very large aspect or central element of whiteness, and how does masculinity, whiteness, and fossil fuels come together, and would a decolonial or post-colonial perspective on petromasculinity add something else that we could use to understand phenomena such as Trump and, yeah.
Well, the thing is, I think one answer that answers your question is violence. I mean, this is what is also staged in all of these narratives, is that there is some kind of violence towards nature, and then it talks about the consequences of this, right? So this is really a narrative pattern that goes through gold fiction, coal fiction, all raw material fiction, that it is this violence might be staged as a positive thing or as a negative thing. Usually it is negative, and this is actually something that is interesting in these oil narratives, that and this is, I think, in contrast to the coal narratives in Poland, as I know, the ones that I know at least, is that it's in the end it is something bad. In the end, you've done too much, you've gone too far. This is the big lesson that you learn in these stories. So it's not like, I mean, there is this aspect, you might say, okay, then these narratives actually, they say that something like this petromasculine tendencies, that, you know, you are violent towards women, towards nature, is something bad, but then they actually reproduce it on a very abstract level. These stereotypes, they don't really offer different patterns, they don't really offer different identification offers, you know, so it's always the woman at home, passive, looking at all this and maybe commenting on it, but then not doing anything against it, because, and this is not criticized that she doesn't do anything against it, so it's, you know, yeah, so this I would say is kind of the difference between these two, but there is an universal narrative pattern that is, you know, violence towards the earth is not something that is always interpreted as good. But it is, if it is in cases when it is interpreted as something good, it is, this is directed towards Fortschritt, progress. Thank you. So it's so this narrative is also second one. So when you do it, there is progress, and this is also something. And it also, but progress also means that there is some kind of hierarchy, you know. So someone who is leading this progress, someone who is on top, and then there's the people on the bottom. And this is also what petromasculine tendencies do, and it's also something that this white pride movement does, is it tries to suppress certain marginalized groups in order to put itself into the winning position of progress.
Perfect, thank you very much. And on this theme of extractivity and violence against the environment and the violence that comes with environmental damage, I would like to ask Dr. Julia Sachseder, who is Senior Research Fellow at Central European University, in fact, and she's a scholar of international relations and gender studies, to discuss her sort of insights and findings from her research into the coloniality of violence against environmental defenders in a Colombian contemporary context. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Alex. Oops. All right, yeah, as you just said, I'm a political scientist, so a bit different from what we just heard. And I've become increasingly interested in understanding the intersections of environmental and gendered violence and what the implications are for both peace building and green energy transitions. That's also the topic on which I would like to focus today. So when we speak about the climate crisis in international relations, but also beyond, we often discuss how this crisis is posing increasing threats to security and peace on a worldwide scale, leading to complex, interconnected, and also escalating risks with far-reaching consequences that go well beyond the sort of already vulnerable countries. However, less attention is usually paid to those who experience violence or are even killed in their fight against environmental degradation. That's, however, more relevant than ever, considering not only the multiple conflicts globally, but also that governments worldwide are working towards energy transitions to tackle the climate crisis and establish just climate policies. However, to date, we know really very little about how violence might be implicated and reproduced in these developments. In my recent book on the coloniality of violence, I was looking at how women experience violence and conflict in Colombia. And in this talk, I would like to specifically address the question of how to understand violence against environmental defenders in Colombia and what these implications might mean, not only for peace, but also for sort of the bigger questions in terms of green energy transitions. And I conducted in-depth field work with feminist activists and women in Colombia, where I learned that violence was ongoing, despite the recent peace deal that was signed in 2016 between the former government and the left-wing guerrilla FARC. And since the signing of the peace accord, there has been a surge in targeting environmental defenders, making it the country with one of the highest numbers of murdered social leaders in Latin America. Only in 2023, 60 environmental defenders have been killed out of 177 globally. In Latin America. And this violence is gendered and racialized, right? So violence is not and has not been directed against everyone in the same way and with the same purpose, but it disproportionately affects specific groups of the population. Namely, in the Colombian context, it was women, and mainly those from Afro-descendant and indigenous communities who lived in peripheral yet resource-rich territories and who fought and fight for their land and the environment. And these dynamics already indicate that that we do not witness an overall reduction of overt and structural violence, despite the peace agreement. And what I wanted to do is to understand this puzzle. So I wanted to explore and theorize, when does something constitute violence and when security, and for who, and how is that differentiation being made? So what are the conditions that allow to make the distinction between security and violence? And of course, there's the dimension of power inherent in that question. So why is the security of some prioritized while the violence of others is oftentimes overlooked or even hidden? And in order to bring these different levels together, I was trying to develop a concept, the concept of coloniality of violence, to make sense of the broader political, economic, social, and historical conditions that produce violence, and how both local and global actors sort of perpetuated or mitigated them. And I specifically looked at the role of transnational corporations involved in the extraction of oil, gas, and coal in Colombia, such as a gold mining company, Anglo Gold Ashanti, or a coal mining company, Cerrejón. So what we already know about transnational corporations is that they are major contributors to the climate crisis, right? Due to their activities related to the extraction and production of fossil fuels. Greenhouse gases, primary drivers of the global warming, etc., right? But what is not too obvious is how these are and might be related to violence against environmental defenders. So what I would like to do in the following is to speak a bit about how these extractivist practices might perpetuate, but at the same time invisibilize violence. As we know, TNCs oftentimes engage in resource-rich activities, such as mining, and for that, they need access to and control over land, which is oftentimes not terra nullius, right? So how do these actors get access? In the case of Colombia, my research showed that the state and TNCs contracted local militias, mainly paramilitary groups, which are right-wing groups and often closely tied to the state, were used to clear the fertile land. And in case of opposition from environmental defenders, for example, violence was used, but oftentimes outsourced to these groups to facilitate, on the one hand, the implementation of the mega projects in order to enable the extraction, and on the other hand, to maintain the state's persistence and the country's position in the global market, right? And paramilitaries were not randomly chosen, so to speak, but they proved particularly suitable to do this labor of violence against environmental defenders, not only because of economic motivations and incentives, but also because they displayed a toxic militarized masculinity that has always sort of seen women in nature as subordinate. And oftentimes this violence has been used as a strategy of intimidation, which was so effective because it operated by exploiting constructions of gender and race that dehumanized those that were targeted and inscribed disposability onto their bodies. And these intersections rendered violence not only as a direct attack against one body, but also served as a symbolic violence against entire communities and their core values. And this then contributed to the affected communities emerging weaker, more fragmented and divided, and thus it facilitated clearing the land in the end. So women who advocate for environmental protection and oppose environmentally harmful practices are particularly vulnerable, right? We know this already and we've heard that already. But what I wanted to sort of highlight is how TNCs are not only indirectly related to violence by polluting the environment and destroying entire ecosystems, but they also might directly benefit from violence against environmental activists who defend their land against these very resource extractions. And these insights already show that there is a link between corporations, the state, and gendered violence. That's, however, not by accident, because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But when we put on feminist decolonial lenses, so to speak, we see that that a masculinist modern colonial project has evolved and also continues to depend on the domination of certain groups and nature, so humans and non-humans, who needed to be rendered controllable and constructed as subordinate and exploitable. So if we conceive of violence against environmental defenders as a coloniality of violence, we might be able to ask questions in terms of how, when, and whose lives become disposable, who's allowed to live and who can die, and who are more inside and who are more outside of the humanity. And given these interrelations, I hoped it became a bit clearer why the violation of the human rights of some, of in this case environmental defenders, who might pose a threat to capital accumulation, can be continued and at times systematically and strategically ignored. So violence should not be understood as sort of a byproduct or an exception or an individualizing factor, but really as a function and an articulation of the global political economy. So what might these observations and findings imply now for green energy transitions? So it might be true, right, that the production of clean energy, such as green hydrogen, a project that I'm currently focusing on, is oftentimes CO2-free and therefore better for the climate, raising really big hopes to finally be able to tackle the climate crisis. However, given the linkages between corporations, the state, and violence, we need to understand more whether, and if so, how the Green New Model really enables a change in societal inequalities and how it might alter the situation of those already marginalized and disproportionately affected by violence. However, research is still only emerging, right, on this nexus. On the one hand, some would argue that energy systems can really, that these new energy systems can really catalyze a violent conflict, because to get access to renewable energy resources might not be as contentious compared to other scarce resources such as oil, coal, etc. On the other hand, some would argue and have already warned that if green energy transition continue to rely on socio-technical and economistic discourses, they will likely not change present inequalities and might still face environmental limits. It may even continue to be environmentally destructive due to only technological fixes as a solution to the climate crisis rather than sort of a holistic, more comprehensive approach, and increase the pressure or continue to increase the pressure on resources in Latin America but also on other continents and reproduce their position at the world's material and raw material supplier. A situation which has increasingly been referred to as green extractivism or green colonialism. So what do we gain now from this perspective? And if you combine these insights that I just presented with the ones I sought to provide up before, concerns might arise that green energy transition not only risk to a certain degree to reproduce the commodification of nature, but also externalizing environmental costs and risks. It might also be potentially violent, or at least not address these relations of violence, especially if it continues to rest on colonial and gendered human environmental relations that construct some parts of the population and nature as some separate yet somewhat related categories that are constructed as always already inferior. And thus, they might continue to be actually a primary target of violence. And these insights, I hope, offer kind of a pragmatic insight, or rather a critique of certain pragmatism, that to challenge these patterns of violence, we not only need anti-discrimination policies or green policies that cure the symptom, but really an approach to green energy transition that accounts for potentially violent implications of such green extractivist practices, and asks and names also the actors and interests involved in that, conceptualizing and addressing them not as isolated from, but rather as a part of a larger political ecological problem that might pose an impediment and an obstacle to any sort of sustainable, critical, sustainable and peaceful future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. It really resonates what I'm going to speak about next about Mexico. You did some work for me analyzing the situation. Since I'm an anthropologist, so I will have a kind of methodological question to you, of course. I would like to know when you were, because this is very unusual, or not maybe, okay, this is not very usual. The political scientist is doing ethnography and he's doing good job. I have read her book and and Felicidades, this was really very good ethnography. So no, because we have very bad reputation in anthropologists of criticizing everybody for their methodology. No, I just want to ask you, that might be also probably interesting for the audience. If women, your research participants, how they understood coloniality, if they understood the reality of violence and environmental violence in terms of coloniality. This is my question.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. Well, interestingly, I mean, even before I went to do field work, I was interested in feminist and decolonial questions. So there has always already been uncertain bias. But what I learned through the interviews with many women is that most of them, activists or not, so to speak, if you can actually make this distinction, are very political subjects and understand very well sort of the broader historical, political, economic relations that actually contribute to this ongoing violence, right? And I was kind of fascinated and impressed with how much knowledge about coloniality, even as a concept, has been present in daily activities compared to, let's say, many feminist movements in the global north, where these things are starting to feature and to be discussed, but that has always been there because it has been a daily reality of their lives, so to speak.
Thank you so much to both of you, and I would segue then to Dr. Renata Hryčuk's presentation. Dr. Hryčuk is an anthropologist based at the Institute for Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Warsaw. Since 1999, she has been conducting field work in Poland, in Lithuania, and in Mexico, particularly in the south of Mexico and Oaxaca. She has published broadly, especially the series Gender and Anthropological Perspective, which will soon have its third volume. So congratulations for that. And Dr. Hryčuk focuses on culinary tourism and heritagization of local food cultures in southern Mexico using a feminist and decolonial anthropological methods, and I'm very excited that she is here and will be talking to us about recent and not so recent developments in Mexico.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I usually don't speak about Mexico in these kind of events, just conferences. And it's not easy to speak about Mexico in this part of the world because it's right like speaking about Colombia, because this is really very, very, if you don't know the reality, it's very difficult to relate to what we are speaking about. But okay, so I just put in my short bio this recent research, but I'm a social anthropologist, and I have been working and living on and off in Mexico for more than 2 decades. And I'm going to just mention 3 researchers because I'm going to refer to 3 different researchers. I've done research on cultural politics of motherhood in poor neighborhoods of Mexico City. I've worked the impact of development programs on the indigenous communities in central Mexico, and recently the making of food heritage and gastropolitics in Oaxaca in the south of Mexico. And I was thinking what I could contribute here to this panel. And well, feminists, and I'm going to follow my notes because I tend to talk too much, so you have to forgive me, I'm going to follow my notes. Feminist anthropologists usually include personal experience, embodied experience, while talking about research based on classic ethnography fieldwork. So this is what I'm going to do today. And I should mention at the very beginning that when you do fieldwork in Mexico, when you go out there and do this classic ethnographic research, whatever the topic, there are 3 issues impossible to avoid. It's migration, it's violence, and the environmental problems. And at first, when I got invited by Alexandra, I thought I would talk about social movements and grassroots mobilizations in Mexico to protect the country's right to food sovereignty, and using the Western term, eco-feminist struggles of indigenous women, because this is part of my research, my current research. But I have changed my mind only yesterday in the morning, inspired by the results of Mexican presidential elections. As you probably already know, Claudia Sheinbaum won by a landslide on the 3rd of June. She's an experienced, openly feminist politician, a former head of the government of Mexico City. Sheinbaum represents the left-wing coalition of the ruling Morena party, left populist, the Mexican Labor Party, and the third, quite exotic partner, the Ecological Green Party of Mexico, this party is called Green Conservative and lacking true commitment to environmental causes. For example, a couple of years ago, they supported the death penalty, the reintroduction of death penalty in Mexico. So this is a quite exotic. Don't judge it by European standards of green parties. Okay, so Sheinbaum's political biography combines 2 themes of this panel, feminism and the environment. A scientist by profession, Sheinbaum has a PhD in energy engineering, used to work at the biggest Mexican public university, UNAM, in Mexico City. Her academic work was focused on energy, the environment, and sustainable development. She also has a background in environmental policy, having served as Minister of the Environment for Mexico City and worked at the International Panel on Climate Change. She's apparently an expert in green transformations. And when I say that her political biography combines the 2 themes of this panel, feminism and the environment, you must know that Mexico is the champion when it comes to legal regulations for women's rights and environmental regulations. But basically, they are only paying lip service to women's rights and environmental issues, unfortunately. So when we talk about so-called green transformation in Mexico, we should not only focus on top-down party politics or lack of them in environmental policy, but on the power of social movements and the strengths or lack of strengths of indigenous communities. And here I'm going to do some storytelling, or as we say in anthropology, we're going to use ethnographic vignette. I'm going to speak about my personal experience of doing research and living in Mexico City. almost two decades ago, almost 20 years ago, in 2005, I was living in Mexico City with a Mexican family in a poor neighborhood of Iztapalapa. And in the spring, we used to get up very early with my adoptive mom, Ana Maria. You know, anthropologists, when we live for a long time somewhere, we have adoptive parents, adoptive families, then we have grandchildren, not godchildren, not grandchildren. So I used to get up very early with my adoptive mom, Ana Maria, around 3 a.m. And we were filling with water all the available containers, buckets, everything we had at home, because at that early hour there was some water. There was some water in the pipes. So living in Mexico City, and I lived for 2 years doing my research for my PhD. I experienced what Garcia Canclini called the democratic forms of degradation. I suffered from water shortages and air pollution. You know, Mexico City, it's more than 20 million people, and there is an ongoing environmental crisis resulting from urbanization and demographic boom, uncontrolled expansion of the city. This is ongoing. So the same spring in 2005, we watched news in the afternoon with my adoptive mom. And we saw a news report on national TV, a short film about indigenous Mazahua women in their colorful dresses, demanding access to water in the amount and of the quality that would satisfy the needs of local communities, water needed for agriculture and potable water. And it was very unusual. The system for delivering water to Mexico City placed in Mazahua region disrupted water management in local communities and led to a prolonged drought and increased rate of migration. So what brought media attention? Because mobilizations of protest of indigenous women are hardly ever taken into account until now. Maybe with social media it has improved a little bit. So what brought media attention 20 years ago? So women were occupying a water treatment plant for the capital city. The occupation threatened to cut off the capital's water supply. That's why all the journalists and TV went there, central Mexico, to their region, to their communities, and they were filming, and women had the chance for the first time in their lives, the women who could speak Spanish, because not all of them could speak Spanish, just the younger leaders, and they could talk, they could talk about their demands and their situation, because they threatened the capital city supply. Later that year, and I was still in Mexico City living with Ana Maria. So they came to Iztapalapa to organize protest in our district. I mean, Iztapalapa, how many citizens, how big is Vienna? So Iztapalapa is 2 million or more right now. So when I speak about this district, this is, huge place. So they were coming to do demonstrations, sit-ins, in Iztapalapa, near the local university, and we found out about it. And I went with Ana Maria, and Ana Maria, my adoptive mom, was a seamstress. She was not a university professor. She was, from classes populares, from, lower strata. And we joined the protests. We didn't do the sit-in, but they were there for a couple of weeks, and we were going there, bringing them food and supporting, chanting, and they were joined by urban activists from Iztapalapa. So these two groups, plus supporters, we were near the campus of the local university for a couple of weeks. I didn't spend that much time there, but so it was the movement had a lot of support. They also were using the strategies copied from Zapatistas, Zapatista women. So they have very successful media strategies, the representation was all right. It was resonating with the media, with the social movements in the city, and Mexico has very strong social movements. And then the movement died out. It lasted 4 years, from 2003 and 2007. And I got so inspired that I joined a research project, Polish and Mexican anthropologists and geographers. We were doing research in Mazahua region. I went there in 2011 and 12 to work on the development industry, on the impact of all those gender programs, you know, based on global feminism, empowerment, et cetera, entrepreneurial projects for women. And at that time, the movement was finished, as it was co-opted by local political parties, and a few leaders co-opted by political parties. The movement failed for different reasons. Well, they were criticizing the logic of neoliberal modernization, of course, but the main reason, I think, not only myself, it's not only my opinion, was the weakness of local indigenous identity. Because you probably think of Mexico as kind of monolithic place, but Mexico is a federation, and it's very, very different. And when we move into the south, to Oaxaca, where I have been working for more than 10 years now, Oaxaca is the opposite. Very strong indigenous communities based on customary law, usos y costumbres, very strong social movements. So this is the second case. I've been working in Mexico and in Oaxaca using this classic methodology of multi-site research. So I'm placed in the city and I go to communities. I very often go to the south of Oaxaca. The south is known for its very strong Zapotec ethnic identity, for political struggles. Women have been struggling, have been fighting for their political rights there for the last 50 years. So I go very often to the region of Istmus de Tehuantepec. I couldn't show you the map, but when you imagine the map of North America, this is the narrowest part, Istmus de Tehuantepec. And on the Pacific side, this is the region, this is Istmo de Tehuantepec, basically Zapotec communities. So I go there very often because I follow my friends, cooks, and to their communities, and I participate in an extended system of ritual fiestas that last sometimes a week. So I go there regularly, and over the years I have been able to observe the changing landscape of the region. And to go from Juchitán to other communities, you need to pass this narrowest part. And this is very windy part of Isthmus. It's said that this region has the biggest, the best wind capacity on the planet. So the strongest winds, the best conditions for wind farms and this renewable energy, etc. So you cross this part, and it's marked, this part of Isthmus, and it's marked with wind farms called eólicas. All these renewable energy projects. It's also the migrant trail. So the last time I was crossing this region, this part of Isthmus, I had eólicas on the one side, and we were traveling by car, and I had constant, groups of migrants after migrants crossing this part to reach the train called the Beast. Okay, so at first, when we erase this migration element, at first, Eurocentric site, it looks very promising. So-called clean energy, green transformation, Western global Northern style. Economic growth and sustainable development. But there is a lot of popular resistance on the part of local communities and grassroots indigenous movements protesting against these development projects, considered openly another form of neocolonial extractivism. Transnational companies, basically Spanish and French, but also las gringas, in Mexico, la gringa or el gringo, this is North American, or a person of white skin, but probably it's more estadounidense, so a citizen of the United States. Transnational companies collaborate with local governments post-colonial elites and drug cartels in order to grab land and other natural resources and illegally expropriate local communities, indigenous and mestizo. So this is basically green grabbing. They of course use different strategies and narratives and discourses, to get social license to operate, use corporate social responsibility programs, political clientelism, etc., etc. But basically, when you talk to people, when you talk to activists, when you talk at those fiestas, because I've never done research on the topic, but I've been many times there and spent a lot of time with people. So, and this is the basic for social anthropology, participant observation. This is when you hear gossip, when you overhear and you participate in political strategizing, etc., etc. So environmental injustice, this is like the keyword. And of course, that's why I asked Alexandra if her research participants and how they understood coloniality. And this is true in Latin America. People know how to do politics from below. They really understand what is going on. And they speak about la lucha en la defensa del territorio, so the struggle to defend the territory understood in individual terms, because the body is a territory, and in collective terms, cuerpo es territorio, cuerpo es colectividad. So they, of course, understand coloniality of power, coloniality of gender. They use they coin up terms picked up then by scientists like sustainable violence. When you read texts, because there's quite a lot published on ISTMO and this crisis, wind farm crisis. So I can spot political slogans in the text of some researchers, and they don't quote the activists for those slogans. It's very, very interesting. Okay, so the wind projects, because in the north of the region, you have those wind projects. The south is resisting. So the wind projects in the north of the region resulted in a rise of income inequality, temporary work contracting, token social works, and widespread health and ecological concerns. Today, the residents of La Ventosa, this is this place where the eolicas and migrants meet, continue to struggle for greater inclusion in wind energy profits shares, including access to civil works such as sewers, roads, and improved healthcare facilities. Residents are also negotiating for heavily subsidized, if not free, electricity for the town, because they don't benefit. They don't benefit from the electricity is sold to Walmart and Coca-Cola, based in the U.S. Not local communities have nothing really from these wind farms. And in the south, the communities demonstrate. There are demonstrations, violent confrontations, sabotage. They sometimes destroy these windmills. They block the roads. And even there has been like 2 or 3 insurrections in some communities. And following the indigenous rule of complementary of gender roles, women, mestizo and indigenous, especially Zapotec women from Juchitán, participate in social organizing and political struggle from the early 1970s. And if we could, I could show you a picture of grandmas. They are called grandmas, women who overruled a local government in Juchitán in the early 1970s and established a left-wing government. They are in their 70s and 80s. They are now protesting against wind farms, right? So they have never been demobilized, really. They have been constantly en la lucha, fighting and struggling. So, but as was already mentioned in the case of Colombia, but female environmental activists are more often than men persecuted and killed by military, police, and private security. Here, different political and social groups, and I mean here feminist groups, state feminism, academic feminism, grassroots feminism, and different women movements come together in feminist struggle against feminicide, feminicidio. And I would like to stop here, finish. This is the dark part of the story, the darkest part of the story, the rate of femicide and feminicidio in Mexico, in spite of excellent laws, in spite that they have just elected the first female president. It has been horrible, and it's continued to be horrible in Mexico. We usually, probably I will have this question from the audience. We are usually not the victims, white women traveling to Latin America because of racism. So we are not, I don't feel insecure in Mexico. Of course, I don't get into trouble. But feminicidio is a problem of Mexico, and the darker skin, the poorer you are, the more chance that you will get killed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fresco of so many factors that impact developments in Mexico, and clearly not just Mexico. So let's be clear about that. I will have a quick question for you, Renata, which is when you talked about the occupation of the water treatment plant in the neighborhood you were living in. We've heard a lot about sort of this vernacular grassroots level discourses that are anti-colonial, that are articulating very clear visions of environmental justice at the grassroots level. And I'm wondering, so what were the slogans when this was occupied? I think and why was it gendered? Why was it the women occupying the power plant? How would you interpret that? And if there's any other...
Okay, yes, they... As I said, I was surprised when I went to this Mazahua region. It's a region with high rates of social marginalization, soil erosion, high rates of migration, very, very poor. And they have been trying to organize to no avail, and a very, very, very strong political clientelism, because corruption and political clientelism, there are two features of Mexican politics, especially on the local level. And they have been trying, and then I think that they found out it was 20 years ago, about the Zapatistas, women, and they were copying, they were marching, they had wooden rifles, and they formed an army, Mazahua army, in defense of water. So they were marching, they were occupying, there was a camp, and men were cooking, so, there was this reverse of gender roles. It also attracted media attention. So very successful media strategy, a very successful strategy of representation, and they were protesting as mothers. So in their role of mothers, the guardians of the community, the guardians of the nature, of the environment. So those, gender roles. But as I said, as I mentioned in the case of Oaxaca, indigenous communities are still based on the complementarity of gender roles. So it's not that when men do political work, women are left behind. They usually collaborate, but here women took charge, and they used the framework of motherhood, of fighting for the sake of their children. And this is a mestizo. This is not indigenous, discourse. This is mestizo, Mexican hegemonic discourse of mothering. A mother who sacrifices her life for the sake of children, and this is, women were allowed, like from the 1980s on, in the times of crisis, to step from their traditional roles if it was necessary for the survival of the family. So they were, starting earning money outside of the household. They were getting into politics, etc., etc. But this is not the discourse, the hegemonic discourse for the indigenous communities. This is mestizo discourse. So they were using, in a very skillful way, different strategies and different discourses, and it was successful. They didn't have the political base, basically.
Just another question. Thanks very much for your presentation. I hope we can continue the conversation afterwards. I was thinking, or I asked myself whether you know and have worked with Madres Buscadoras, the mothers looking for the disappeared, and how sort of if you know anything about that, because I've recently learned from one of my PhD students who is doing a PhD on this very topic, that they have a very specific understanding of human non-human relations and about the environment, the body and the environment. And I was wondering whether you have any insights on that.
I have heard about them. I haven't worked with them because Madres Buscadoras, so mothers looking for their disappeared children. There is this term in Latin American Spanish, desaparecidos. So people disappear. You cannot find their bodies. And it started during the right-wing governments in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile. But right now, you have, Mexico, as I said, this is a huge country. And the femicide crisis, this is basically the north. Because of the migration trail, because of vast empty areas, etc., because of the assembly plants at the border. They pushed the associations of mothers, the members of the families of the disappeared. They started looking for the bodies in the 1990s, and they pushed the public opinion, global public opinion, and the local governments to act. But in Mexico, you have huge areas that we call stateless, where the state does not really work, and instead you have the culture of impunity. It's a very complex problem. I've heard about them, but they work in the north. And they are very persistent. There are several movies about them, one very bad one. Not all the movies about this topic are good. So no, I haven't worked with them. But they are the principal force behind this political activism of, trying to find the bodies and the bodies, because they are not looking for their children or for their sisters who are alive. They know that they are not alive. They just want to find the bodies.
Thank you. Katarzyna, would you have a question? I would like to give you the word for your presentation, because I'm very excited to ask Dr. Katarzyna Stanczak-Wyślicz, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Science, a member of the Women's Archive research team and the Committee of Women's History, which is a section of the Polish Historical Committee. Dr. Stanczak-Wyślicz has a doctorate in literary studies and an MA in history, and her interests range from gender and women's history in post-war Poland to popular culture and the history of transformations in general. So her book, her co-authored monograph, Women in Poland, Modernization, Equality, Communism, has appeared already in Polish and will soon appear in English at CU Press, so we're looking forward to that. And Kasia is my dear colleague also in the project Heresy, which is on women's political thought in Central and Eastern Europe from the 1920s to the 2000s, whose PI, Zsófi Loran, instigated this panel. And Kasia mentioned very excitedly having begun to work with eco-feminist zines from the 1990s. And I thought that immediately she must be here to present more, because I thought the notion of post-socialist transformation and green transformation links very well to also this notion of passing to an extractivist economy mentioned by Anna. So without further ado, Kasia, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, for giving me an opportunity to speak in this very friendly environment, as Alex introduced me. And I will be talking about a phenomenon which grew out of the deep crisis of the 1980s in Poland, and then from the changes described as economic, political, and social transformation of the 1990s. And suddenly, it somehow died out. And this is very preliminary stage of research. So firstly, as a historian, I will start with a few words of background. At the beginning of the 1990s, during the times of the transformation, Poland was diagnosed with a great environmental crisis with very high water and air pollution levels. It was due to the communist modernization that began after 1945 and was focused mainly on the urbanization and rapid industrialization, with a special emphasis put on mining and metallurgy. Environmental degradation as a phenomenon of so-called industrial capitalism was mostly ignored in the public debate, but not by the experts. It's not true that it was completely silenced. However, it was forbidden by the censorship to write about the contamination of the environment or about the negative health effects caused by the industry until the end of the 1970s. Only in 1980, the Polish government finally acknowledged that it had a great problem with air and water pollution. The expert group of ecologists, biologists, botanists formed a kind of state-controlled body, expert body. At the same time, the environmental concern was also articulated by some members of the democratic oppositions, such as activists of the freedom and peace movement, Wolność i Pokój, which was formed in 1985. However, at this time, it has nothing to do with feminism. For the first time, the relationship between gender and the environmental degradation was discussed after the Chernobyl catastrophe in April 1986 and during the huge protests against the construction of the Żegnowiec nuclear power plant. The original decision to build a nuclear power plant was made in January 1982. The sole idea provoked protests from the very beginning. But due to the Chernobyl effect, the most turbulent protests took place in the second half of the 1980s. And activists from the freedom and peace movement, such as Małgorzata Teresiewicz, who later identified herself as a feminist and who was active in feminist movement, presented the nuclear power as a danger mostly to women and children. And this aspect was highlighted in the samizdat publications. Of course, gender was used as a tactic in the political struggle, in the oppositional discourse, but the protests had an effect, and finally, the first post-communist government decided to stop the construction of this nuclear power plant. And actually, the beginning of the eco-feminist thought can be traced in Poland in the decade of the 1990s, after the political transformation, or rather during the political transformation. I think it's more the issue of the transformation. This resulted, of course, from the development of the open public sphere, where grassroots movements, including feminism, could appear. But when discussing the history of the Polish feminism during the times of the political transformation, always the impact of the Western feminist thought is in the center of the analysis. However, in the latest research, I'm telling we, so we historians, we literary researchers who are now interested in the history of Polish feminism, we are more and more focused on the local traditions of women's activism. And in the case of the ecofeminism, it is clear that these two factors are equally important: the transfer from the West and also the local tradition. But first of all, despite my strong interest in anarcho-ecofeminism, I must say that it was rather a marginal trend, within the feminist movement. It can be even said that the mainstream feminism of the 1990s did not notice these environmental problems because they had so many problems that it was just on the margin of their interest. It was the punk movement with its anarchistic agenda and with its comprehensive criticism of the political power relations that gave a platform, that gave a floor for new initiatives related, for example, to animal rights, to environmental issues, and also to the health problems connected with environmental destruction. In the 1990s, the punk movement in Poland was already included in the international circulation of information and exchange of ideas. They have close connections, especially with German and Czech organizations. Maybe not organizations, maybe rather informal groups, because it's difficult to say organization when we are talking about anarchists. And in fact, the first eco-feminist groups were born out of transnational cooperation and also, which is equally important, of private contacts with anarcho-feminists from abroad and mainly from Germany. For example, the Ecofemina group, it was formed in Poznań. They published the zine Ecofemi, which published texts written by German ecofeminists, and also they informed about environmental protests in Western Europe and also about the Western boycott of consumerism. So they were mostly focused on what was happening in Germany and in Western Europe, and according to Poland, they just tried to explain what does it mean ecofeminism, and what does it mean environmental movements. The Green Brigades, it was an eco-punk zine, and later a regular magazine, in 1991 published the first very basic information on ecofeminism, referring of course to the Western women's spirituality movement. So it was about the Western witches and so on and so on. Similarly, Feminka, a zine published by informal group in Poznań as early as 1993, this zine declared an interest in vegetarianism, animal rights, and also the rights of LGBT people. They were also inspired by Western publications. Its author, Anna Quiz, who was also a member of a punk band, this punk band was called Matka Boska in Polish, it means Our Lady. They referred to Western ethical reflection on vegetarianism as a solution to the problems of environmental catastrophe. It looked, and in fact, it was a transfer of ideas. But at the same time, around 1993, the punk rock group Women's Hell, Piekło Kobiet, was formed in Łuków, Podlasie. Łuków, it's a very small city in Podlasie, in eastern Poland. And it was something surprising that it was not formed in Warsaw, not in Kraków, Poznań, but in Łuków, which is exactly nowhere, in the middle of nowhere.
Come on.
Sorry. I have family near Łuków. And this group was later affiliated with the coeducational anarcho-feminist radical group. It was called Radical Anarcho-Feminist Group Witches, Wiedźmy. It was founded in 1996, and it organized people from the Podlasie region, but also from Warsaw. From the 1997, they published a zine, Wiedźma, the witch, in which they attacked Catholic Church for misogyny, and they focused on women's reproductive rights, women's health, and also on traditional gendered knowledge and environmental degradation. What is interesting, this group referred to both Polish intellectual tradition, because Woman's Hell, this is a title of the book by Tadeusz Bojzielański, an interwar advocate of women's reproductive rights, a Piekło Kobiet. And at the same time, they refer to the local knowledge and to the folk tradition because they named themselves Wiedźmy. Wiedźmy, not czarownica. In Polish, this is a difference. Because Polish czarownica, it means a wiedźma in Western context. Czarownica, this is this witch which was burned on the stake. But wiedźma, it's more like someone who deals with traditional healing, something called with paganism, and who has this woman's power. A healer, yes, it's a healer, like Szeptucha in Podlasie region. After 2000, they appeared more organizations, informal groups, and also zines and publications that focused on the criticism of liberal economy and capitalism consumerism. And for example, the zine Clitoris, which was announced as feminist active, lesbian power, animal liberation. It appeared in 2003, and although it was focused mainly on the lesbian sexuality, and although they advocated mostly for the idea of feminist resistance to political power, they were also engaged in the criticism of modern consumerism as destructive for the environment. So, as you can see, there were several groupings, not formal, they don't exist anymore, and it is difficult to find any traces of their activity. As a historian, I must tell something about the sources. Only single issues of these feminist anarcho-zines can be found in Polish libraries. Some of them are still in the private collections, and this is the best source of the anarcho-feminist zines, but not the former anarcho-feminists are so happy to show their collection. What can I say about my actors? First of all, most of them expressed a kind of nostalgic for the ideal past. I think it's rather an imagined or constructed past, imagined feminist utopia based on the harmony of nature. According to Wiedźma, the witch, women were naturally connected to the nature and they did not harm nature. The development of male civilization and of course of Christianity in Poland negatively affected the environment. And those anarcho-feminists from the witch group referred, of course, to the Western women's spirituality movements, but more important, to the local tradition. As I said before, it was surprising that they were active in Podlasie, which was perceived and still is perceived as a rural, rather backward region, rather poor, with very rich traditions of Polish, Belarusian, and also Ukrainian folklore. And certainly it was a region that did not benefit from the economic transformation and the development of liberal economy. Maybe that was why Polish anarcho-eco-feminists identified the violence towards women with the destruction of the nature, and they used it as a metaphor for their sufferings connected with the liberal transformation. They also engaged the discourse of animals' rights just to tell about the transformation, about this liberal transformation. They somehow challenged the narrative of progress, but not this old communist narrative of progress, but this narrative of progress connected with the liberal transformation. They did not show any idea what to do, how to change the situation. They focused on what should be stopped, but not how it should be transformed. Thank you.
Thank you to all four of you for this fantastic presentations. I will point out that there is a sound check that needs to happen at exactly 13:50. We have received 5 more minutes on pain of punishment and so on. So I would invite one question for Kasia, and then we will take four questions from the public. And then festival style, I would invite all of us then to converse in the coffee area and on the lawn to take the conversation further. Thank you.
As an insider, I'm going to ask you because, the eco-anarcho-feminism kind of vanished. But the animal rights movement that started at the same time has been developing, and the organizations established in the late 1980s are still here, like Gaia Club. Why do you think is that?
I think it's completely... What changed? It was that these anarcho-feminists grow out of somehow oppositional movements, but these not mainstream oppositional movements, and their agenda was completely different. They didn't maybe know how to operate after the transformation, when the transformation was somehow finished, and maybe they were too anarchistic. I think that they somehow died out, but not completely. I'm really very happy, and I think that now many young activists they adopted these movements of animal rights, and I think we can see some continuities, although this is the different formula.
Okay, the floor is open for questions.